What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. Today, I want to answer a question I get all the time, and it's, what do bass look like on a fish finder, and how can you differentiate bass from other species of fish? And so we're going to look at different views from my Humminbird unit, the 2D sonar, down imaging, and side imaging to show you what bass look like, what other species of fish look like, and what other pieces of cover and structure look like as well that you might be confusing for bass. And so should be a really interesting video, so let's get into it. So first up, let's talk about what fish look like in general on a fish finder. This might be crappie, bass, catfish, any type of fish. We're not talking about a specific species here. Just what do fish look like on your fish finder. And they're going to look different on the different types of sonar on your fish finder, whether you're looking at the 2D or traditional sonar or the side imaging and down imaging. And so let's talk about the differences now. So let's start by taking a look at traditional 2D sonar. And this is the type of sonar that comes standard with all fish finders. And on 2D sonar, fish are going to look like arches when the boat is moving at speed, and fish are going to look like straight, squiggly lines when the boat is stationary. And this has to do with how the transducer interacts with the bottom and how moving at speed affects how that transducer interacts with the fish. And so I'm not going to get into that in this video, but just trust me that on 2D sonar, fish are going to look like arches when the boat is moving, and they're going to look like kind of lasagna lines. They're straight when the boat is stationary. And I do have videos explaining all of this on my channel. I'll link a couple of them here, but it's definitely important to know the difference between what fish look like when your boat is moving, when they're stationary on this 2D sonar. The other type of sonar you may have on your fish finder is down imaging and side imaging. And I only recommend looking at the returns from side imaging and down imaging when your boat is moving at speed. A lot of times this image can get distorted if your boat is stationary or only moving at like 1 mile an hour. These images are definitely a lot clearer when your boat is moving at speed. So we're only going to look at images when my boat's actually moving, not when it's stationary. So when your boat is moving 2 miles an hour or more, fish are going to look like small dots on the down imaging and the side imaging. And the size of these dots is going to vary by the species of fish, also by the settings on your graph, whether you're messing with your sensitivity, the contrast, as well as the range, as far as like if you set your range to 30 feet, 60 feet, 80 feet. Those will all affect the size of the dots. And so a lot of times it's kind of hard to set rules as to which species of fish you're looking at based on the size of the dot. But one thing I will say is if you do see some really big dots in the water like this, a lot of times this is bait fish, or if you see them by the bottom, it could be a big rock. And then dots that are really tiny might be really small fish like bait fish or just debris in the water. And so I'll give some guidelines about how big dots will be when they're bass that I use, and I'll give you some range and sensitivity settings that I like to use as well. But in general, fish on your down imaging and your side imaging are going to show up as dots. So one more call out about down imaging and side imaging is that it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish fish from the bottom or the cover. And a lot of times if you see dots that are really close to the bottom, maybe one side of that dot will actually be connected to the bottom of the lake. And that could either be a rock, it could be a stick, or it could be a fish. It's kind of hard to tell. And so the only way you can know for sure if you're looking at a fish is to find a dot that is completely surrounded by black space. That black space is water, and so if there's nothing else connected to that dot and it's completely surrounded by black space, that's going to be either a fish, a ball of bait fish, or maybe if there's a lot of debris in the water, it could be some debris, but a lot of times it's actually fish. And so just make sure you pay attention to that when you're trying to identify fish, because sometimes you might misidentify rocks and cover and other stuff as actual fish. So one thing that confuses people who are new to fish finders is the difference between the 2D sonar and the down imaging. And a lot of times they'll think that fish will look like arches on both the down imaging and on the 2D sonar, but they're different. Bass will show up as arches on the 2D sonar and dots on the down imaging. So it's going to be different. It just is a difference in how the sonar actually picks up the image from the bottom, how it pings, things like that. Again, very technical stuff I'm not going to get into in this video. Just know with down imaging and with side imaging, you're going to see dots 2D sonar, you see arches. I feel like I'm repeating this point a lot, but it is a point of confusion for a lot of people, so I want to make sure it's super clear because it's really important to understand for the rest of this video and for being a successful offshore fisherman who reads their Fishfinder. So now that we know what fish look like on different types of sonar, we next have to differentiate the species of fish using clues in the sonar image. And this takes a lot more experience, a lot more nuanced study of an image to determine which species of fish you're actually looking at. But I do have some basic guidelines that will help you identify bass from other species. And we're only going to focus on bass in this video. I'm not going to get into all the nuances of identifying other species of fish. All I want you guys to learn from this video is how to determine if the fish are bass or if they're another species of fish. So the first thing I'm going to do when I'm trying to determine if a dot is a bass or if it's another species of fish or something else entirely is look at the size of that dot. And my rule of thumb is that bass are going to be about the size of when you take a ballpoint pen, stick it into a piece of paper, and twist it 2 times. That's about the size of the dot you're going to get. And that's going to be when you're running your graph on medium settings, basically the default settings. If the sensitivity is really, really high or really, really low, those dots will appear smaller or they'll appear bigger because the return from the fish is going to be stronger. And so again, not getting all the details of sonar today. I'll talk about that in other videos coming up. But if you use that rule of thumb, that will at least get you in the ballpark of the size dot you want to be looking for on your Fishfinder. Now, the only other thing that might throw off that rule of thumb is if you have the range on your graph set really, really wide. So if the range on your graph on your down imaging is, let's say, 120 feet, the dots are going to look really, really small compared to everything else in the picture. And so my rule of thumb is that I like to run the range on my graph about maybe 10 to 15 feet deeper than the deepest point that I think fish are going to be on a given lake. So if I think fish are going to be in 40 feet of water, I'll set that range to 55 feet. If I think they're going to be in 20 foot of water, I'll set the range to 30 feet. This will make sure that the dots are big enough for me to be able to see and identify. And again, the dots will change in size based on the range. So you may have to get a little bit comfortable with adjusting your range and adjusting how big those dots are from lake to lake. The next thing I'm going to look at when I'm trying to determine whether a dot is a bass or another species of fish or something else entirely is by looking at how much space there is between dots in my image. A lot of times when you see fish on your Fishfinder, you'll see that they're grouped up with 10 or 15 other dots. And if you see that these dots have anywhere from a centimeter to a half an inch of space between them, these are most likely going to be bass. But if you see that the dots are really, really tightly grouped together and they're almost right on top of each other, that's most likely going to be another species of fish, like crappie, white bass, etc. And a lot of times I like to compare bass to human beings. And just like humans like to have their own personal space, their personal bubble, bass like to have their own personal space so they can feed and have their own area to kind of hunt bait fish or even just have their own personal space in general. And so just like humans don't like people right on top of each other, a lot of times bass like to have their own space as well, where other species don't mind getting right next to each other, right on top of each other all the time. And the last indicator that a group of dots is bass and not another species of fish is if that group of dots is spread more horizontally than vertically. And usually bass are going to set up along the bottom or suspended in the water column much more horizontally than vertically. So they're going to be longer than they are tall. And so if you look at these groups of fish, all of these groups are spread across the bottom a long ways, but they're not very tall. The fish aren't that high off the bottom. These are going to be bass. Or a lot of times you'll find groups of fish that are spread very tall, basically stacked right up on top of each other, but they aren't spread horizontally or right and left very far. And so these are going to be other species of fish, most of the time crappie. And so this is another indicator that you're dealing with a school of bass as opposed to another school of fish. And those are the 3 main indicators I use to determine if dots are bass. And so in all the schools of bass that I find, you'll find the dots are the size of that ballpoint pen when you stick it into the paper and twist it 2 times. All the dots are going to have at least a centimeter to a half an inch of space between each dot. And you're going to see that the fish are spread more horizontally than they are vertically. Now, one caveat I want to make to rule number 2, that the fish need to have at least a centimeter of space between them, is that sometimes when you find giant groups of fish, what I like to call mega schools, where you have 50 plus fish on the spot, you might find some small groupings of dots in that school that are right next to each other or right on top of each other. And I feel like that's just the result of there being so many fish on the spot that it's kind of unavoidable. But even in a lot of these mega school images I'm showing you, there are still quite a few dots that are separated by a good amount of space. And so sometimes you have to kind of adjust the rules a little bit given the situation. These are not hard, fast rules all the time, but they are going to get you about 95% of the way there, and they are definitely rules that will help you identify bass. Though, again, they may not be foolproof or 100% accurate every single time. Now, one thing you may notice is that I wasn't using my 2D sonar or my side imaging when I was explaining the rules for identifying bass. And the reason for that is because I don't really use those two types of sonar to identify the species of fish. I actually use each sonar for very specific applications. And so I'll use a 2D sonar usually just to identify, are there fish in the area? And these can be really helpful if you're fishing a really rocky area where it's hard to pick out the dots from the rocks on the bottom, or if you're fishing around lots of trees or sort of brush. A lot of times you can use different colors in that 2D sonar to pick out if the fish are actually there. Then I'll use my down imaging to determine what species of fish they are. And the same thing goes with my side imaging. Really, I use the side imaging to determine if there's any sort of cover in the area or if there are fish in the shadows of that cover, and then to determine if those fish are bass or another species, I'll use my down imaging. So the down imaging is really important for identifying if something is a bass or another species, and then the other types of sonar help me identify if there are fish and if there's cover in that area in general. And so hopefully that makes sense. It's important to use all three types of sonar though to get a really good picture of what's on the bottom. So it's not like down imaging is the only thing you should be using, but there are different applications for each type of sonar, and hopefully you'll see that as you watch more of my YouTube videos. So guys, that's how I identify whether I'm looking at bass or another species of fish on my Fishfinder. And there are probably other ways to do this, but this is the way that's been the most effective for me and the way that I learned over the years through trial and error. And so it's definitely a method that works, as you can see in a lot of my YouTube videos. And I know that if you take time on the water and really dial in your graphs and start looking for these things on your Fishfinder, you're going to find a lot more bass offshore as well. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'm making a lot more videos about Fishfinders in terms of how to identify active bass on the graph, how to use your side imaging more effectively, how to graph offshore structure, all kinds of videos that are coming to the channel very soon. So look forward to those. And other than that, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see y'all in the next one.